So we're moving into more and more advanced topics of the JavaScript language. And so now it's time to talk about objects, which are probably the most important subject of the JavaScript language. In the last lecture, we were talking about arrays and how we access elements of a certain array. Now imagine that you would like to access the elements of an array not by its number, not by its order number, but by a specific name, a specific keyword. You couldn't do that, right? So just to remember, with arrays it works like this. So imagine an array 1, 2, 3. Then to access the first one, you would just write it like this. But if we wanted to give each of the members a specific name, then we would have to use objects. Because in objects we have key value pairs, which means that each value has a name, which is then the key. And we use objects to group together different variables that belong together and which have no particular order. That's the key difference. In objects, we don't have a particular order. It doesn't matter the order in which we define the variables. While in arrays, it's not like that. It's important in which order we have our members of our arrays. So the array with data about John that we created in the last lecture could actually be better constructed using an object. So let me show it to you and to see how it works. So such as with arrays, there are different ways of creating objects. But the most important one and the most common one is the so-called object literal, which goes like this. So I'm going to call it John again. And instead of the square brackets, we use the curly brackets. And then we usually hit enter or return to create a new line where we then can put the data. And remember, we have key value pairs in objects. So we have a key, which I will call name, and then the value, which is John. And then once again, such as in the array, we have a comma and then we write the next one. And we usually write each of the elements in a different line. But in JavaScript, it doesn't really matter if you have different lines or any kinds of returns or spaces. JavaScript ignores all of that actually. It's just for us to write it in a more easy way, more legible way, so that our code looks nicer and more organized and clean. So again, we could write it all in one line, but we usually do it like this. So last name was Smith. Then the year of birth, we had defined it as 1990. The job was teacher, and John was not married. So we can see all of these k-value pairs as an individual variable inside of the John object. So we have our 5 elements in this John object, and let's now take a look at it in the console. Alright, so we have an object, and here we have the 5 key value pairs. So name John, last name is Smith, year of birth is 1990, job is teacher, and he is not married. So how do we now retrieve an element out of this object? Now, as I said right in the beginning, the difference here is that we're not going to use numbers, and that the order in which the variables are declared, or the key value pairs are declared inside of the object, does not matter. So to read a value out of an object, there are 2 main ways. The first one is to use the dot notation, and let's say we want to get the last name, we can just write dot last name. And if we console log this, it should say Smith. And that's right, here it is. And a similar way, we will also console log this, is to use the square brackets such as we did with the arrays. So square brackets and then the key. And we have to pass the key here as a string. So we need the quotes and then last name. So let's see. And that's also Smith. So these are the 2 main ways that we read values out of an object. And we can even create a variable which has the name of the key that we want to retrieve. For example, like this. Let's just create a random variable called xyz, which we will call job. And then we can retrieve the value simply like this. John, then the square brackets, and x, y, z. So let's see, this should give us teacher. All right. And that's simply because in this variable container we stored job. So of course this x, y, z was then replaced with the string job. And then it's the same as we have here. So John job is then teacher. Okay, another thing is data mutation. And it's once again very similar to the array. So if we want to change something here, we can make it basically in the same way as we retrieved the values. So let's change John's last name. We can simply do John.last name and say that now he is Miller. And we can also change his job. So John, and use it like this, job, and say that he is now a programmer. And if we console log the John object right now, then this will probably give us these changes. Alright, so John is now Miller. This stayed the same, but now he's a programmer. So data mutation works in a similar way as with arrays and in the way that we read them. So we have the dot notation here first to mutate data and to read data, and we have the brackets notation here first to read data and here to mutate data in the object. Now the last thing that I want to show you in this lecture is that there's a different way of creating an object, just like it was with the array. So let's create now an object for Jane. Var Jane, and now it's not new array, but it's new object. So we have now a new empty object which is called Jane, but which doesn't have any data yet. So we can fill it with data in the same way as we did the data mutation up here. So we can now say Jane.name should be Jane. And Jane dot last name should be Smith. And Jane, and let's now make it a different way. Year of birth should be 1969. And Jane job, let's say, is retired. And finally, Jane is married equals true. So let's now take a look at how this object looks like. So console log Jane, and here we go. So as you can see here in the console, it looks the exact same way as the object that we created for John. We simply did it in a different way. So we have name Jane, last name Smith, year of birth 1969, job retired, and is married true, just as we defined up here. So this is one way of creating an object, and this one is the second way. Okay, this is all I had to tell you in this first lecture about objects. In the next lecture, we will continue with objects and see that we can also use functions in object. So don't wait and come with me right there.